I didn't plan on turning my own land into a junkyard. But the morning I walked out with my coffee and saw what they'd done, something in me snapped so quietly I didn't even realize it until later. You ever have one of those moments where nothing explodes on the outside, but inside, something just locks into place? Yeah, that was one of those. It was a Saturday, early, the kind of morning where the air still holds onto the cool from the night before, and everything feels like it's yours again before the world wakes up. I've got this 5-acre stretch just outside a place called Millbrook Ridge. Not much to look at if you're the type who likes polished lawns and HOA-approved hedges, but to me, it's everything. My grandfather, Walter Boone, bought that land when it was nothing but scrub and clay, and he used to say, "Land don't care who owns it on paper, son, it remembers who respects it." I grew up hearing that, walking those fields with him, learning where the soil stayed soft after rain, where the grass grew thicker, where the fence line used to run before time took it down. So when I stepped out that morning and saw pallets, stacks, metal rods, plastic piping, all spread out like somebody had dumped a hardware store across my pasture, I just stood there for a second thinking maybe I wasn't fully awake yet. Like maybe I'd walked into the wrong place somehow. Bright orange safety fencing wrapped around the mess, cutting a sharp, ugly line through the land I knew like the back of my hand. And there was a sign zip-tied to a post, all neat and official-looking, like that somehow made it okay. Temporary construction storage. Do not disturb. I remember actually laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it didn't register as real right away. Temporary. That word does a lot of heavy lifting for people who don't want to ask permission. Now, right up against my property line, there's this new development, Green Hollow Estates. You've probably seen the type. Big identical houses, wide roads, everything clean and controlled, like someone copy-pasted the same life over and over again. They moved in about 3 years ago, started small, then expanded, and with expansion comes construction, and with construction comes people who think and used land is free land. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, didn't even take another sip, and walked straight out there, boots still dusty from the day before. The grass was flattened in places where they'd driven trucks through, tire marks cutting deep grooves like scars. That bothered me more than the materials, honestly. The idea that they'd just rolled right in without hesitation, like the land was waiting for them. The sign had a phone number on it, so I called. It rang twice before someone picked up, and I could hear machinery in the background, voices shouting, the kind of noise that tells you the person on the other end isn't really thinking about you at all. "Yeah," he said, like I'd interrupted something important. I told him my name, told him I was standing on the land in question, and asked, as calmly as I could manage, why his materials were sitting on my property. There was this pause, not the kind where someone's thinking, but the kind where they're deciding how little effort they can get away with. "Oh, yeah," he said finally, casual as you please. "We just needed a spot for a couple weeks. It's temporary. Don't worry, we'll move it when we're done." I remember tightening my grip on the phone, feeling that slow burn starting in my chest. "You didn't ask." Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a half laugh. "Relax, it's not hurting anything." That line, that's the one that stuck. Not hurting anything. Like the only measure of right and wrong was whether something looked damaged to him. I looked out across the field again, at the way the sunlight hit those stacks of brick, the way the orange fencing cut across the grass, and I thought about my grandfather standing right where I was, hands on his hips, shaking his head at something like this. He wouldn't have raised his voice. He wouldn't have argued. He'd just handled it. "This is private property," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You need to remove everything. Today." He didn't even try to hide the irritation this time. "We've got a schedule to keep. It'll be gone in a couple weeks," like I said. And just like that, the conversation was over for him. Not for me. I hung up, stood there for a while longer, then walked back to the porch and picked up my coffee, which had gone lukewarm. I took a sip anyway, grimaced, and set it back down. Here's the thing about people who treat boundaries like suggestions: they only understand consequences they can see. You can argue, you can threaten, you can quote property law all day long, but until something interrupts their plans, you're just background noise. I wasn't interested in being background noise. That evening, I drove into town and stopped by a place called Richie's Bar and Grill, not because I needed a drink, but because I knew two guys who did. Nate Carter and Luis Mendoza. Nate runs a forklift over at the quarry, Been doing it long enough he can move things in his sleep, and Luis has this old flatbed truck that looks like it shouldn't run, but somehow always does. They were sitting at the far end of the bar when I walked in, arguing about something on the TV, and when they saw me, Nate raised his glass like he already knew I wasn't there just to hang out. "You've got that look," he said. "What look?" I asked. "The one that means somebody's about to regret something." Luis chuckled, slid me a stool. "So who messed up?" I leaned in a little, kept my voice low, and told them what I'd found that morning, how the call went, what the guy said. By the time I got to the part about "it's not hurting anything," Nate just shook his head slow, like he'd heard enough. "That your land?" he asked. "Every inch." Luis tapped the bar with his finger, thinking. "And they didn't ask?" "Nope." There was a brief silence, the kind where a decision gets made without anyone announcing it. Nate finished his drink, set the glass down with a soft clink, and looked at me. "What are you thinking?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I hadn't fully formed it yet, not into words anyway. But the shape of it was there, sitting in the back of my mind all day, growing sharper every time I replayed that conversation. "Finally," I said, "if it's temporary, then moving it shouldn't be a problem." Luis smiled first, slow and knowing. Nate followed, already reaching for his keys. "All right," Nate said, standing up. "Let's go make it more temporary." And that's how it started. We didn't rush it. That's the part people always get wrong when they hear this story. They think it was some reckless, heat-of-the-moment thing, but it wasn't. It was deliberate, slow, almost quiet in a way that made it feel heavier than if we'd just gone and smashing things. By the time we left Richie's, the sky had already gone dark, that deep country black where the stars looked close enough to reach, and the road back to my place was empty except for the hum of Luis's truck and the occasional flicker of headlights miles away. We pulled in with the lights off about 100 yards before the pasture, just letting the engine idle low for a second before cutting it completely. The kind of silence that follows an engine shutting down out there. It's thick, almost like the land itself is listening. Nate hopped out first, already scanning the layout like he was clocking a job site, even though this one definitely wasn't on any schedule he'd been given. "Man," he muttered under his breath, walking a slow circle around the nearest stack of materials. "They really made themselves at home, didn't they?" And he wasn't wrong. Seeing it at night somehow made it worse. The orange fencing glowed faint under the moonlight, the stacks of brick casting long shadows across the grass, and the metal, rebar, pipes, all of it, caught just enough light to look sharp, intrusive, like it didn't belong in the same world as everything else out there. Luis leaned against the side of his truck, arms crossed, just taking it in. "You sure about this?" he asked, not like he was doubting me, more like he was giving me one last chance to change my mind before things crossed a line you don't uncross. I looked out over the pasture again, imagined what it had looked like that morning, what it should look like, and then I heard that voice in my head. "Relax, it's not hurting anything." "Yeah," I said, nodding once. "I'm sure." Nate clapped his hands together softly. "All right then, let's get to work. Now here's where it gets interesting, because we didn't touch a single thing that didn't already belong to them. No damage, no theft, no shortcuts. Everything we did stayed inside one simple line: their stuff, on my land. We just changed the arrangement." Luis backed the flatbed up as close as he could without tearing up more ground, and Nate got the forklift off the trailer like he was unloading groceries. The machine hummed low, its lights cutting clean white paths through the dark, and for a second, watching him settle into the seat, I almost forgot why we were there. It felt routine, like any other night job. Then he lifted the first pallet. Those bricks, they were stacked 3 high, heavy, solid, the kind of thing you don't move unless you've got a reason. Nate eased them up like they weighed nothing, turned the machine smooth, and drove them deeper into the pasture, about 200 yards in, past the slight dip in the land where the grass grows thicker. "Right here," he called back. "Keep going a little," I said, walking ahead, pointing to a stretch of ground that sat just far enough out of sight from the road, but still very much inside my property line. "We're going to build something." He didn't ask what, just nodded and kept moving. And that's how the rhythm started, pallet by pallet, bundle by bundle, roll by roll. Luis and I handled what we could by hand, dragging lighter materials, guiding placements, while Nate did the heavy lifting, literally. The night stretched on around us, the kind of steady, Focused work that makes time blur a little, broken only by the occasional low joke or the scrape of metal against metal. At some point, Luis wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at the growing pile. "You're not just moving this stuff," he said, squinting at me. "You've got something else in mind." I paused, leaning against one of the stacked pallets, catching my breath for a second. "They called it storage," I said. "So we're going to give them storage." Nate laughed from the forklift. "Man, I like where this is going." See, I'd spent part of that afternoon walking the old fence line on the far side of the property, the one my grandfather had put up decades ago, back when barbed wire was more about keeping cattle in than keeping people out. Most of it had rusted, fallen, half buried in the grass, but not all of it. I'd pulled what I could, rolled it up, loaded it onto my tractor, along with a stack of old tires I'd been meaning to get rid of for years. We brought those out next. If moving the materials was about control, building what came after, that was about the message. We started laying out a perimeter, not sloppy, not random, but clean, a rectangle that wrapped tight around every last piece of their precious, temporary storage. Nate set the outer boundary with the forklift, stacking heavier items at the edges like anchor points, while Luis and I stretched the barbed wire between them, pulling it taut, securing it with whatever we had on hand, posts, scrap, even pieces of rebar they'd left behind. "You're basically building a cage," Luis said at one point, stepping back to look at it. I shrugged, adjusting a line of wire. "If the shoe fits." The tires came next, stacked in uneven towers at the corners, then along the sides, not pretty, but solid enough to make the whole thing feel less like a pile and more like a structure. Something intentional. Something you couldn't just casually walk through without making it very obvious what you were doing. By then, the air had started to shift, that subtle hint of morning creeping in long before the sun shows itself. Nate killed the forklift engine for a second, listening. "We've got maybe an hour before light," he said. "Good," I replied. "That's all we need." The last piece, that was mine. Earlier that day, before I'd even fully decided how this would play out, I'd driven into town and picked up a sheet of plywood, nothing fancy, just big enough to be seen from a distance. I'd laid it flat in the barn, grabbed a can of red spray paint, and let the words come without overthinking them. Now, standing there in the dim pre-dawn light, I hauled it out of the truck bed and set it upright near the center of the enclosure. Luis read it first, a low whistle slipping out as he took it in. "Oh, that's gonna sting." Nate leaned over from the forklift seat, squinting. "What's it say?" I didn't answer. I just grabbed a hammer, drove 2 stakes into the ground, and mounted the board so it faced the direction their trucks would come from in the morning. Then I stepped back. In big, uneven red letters, about 10 inches tall, it read, "Storage yard. Courtesy of your own trespassing." There's something about seeing your own behavior spelled out like that. No legal jargon, no polite wording, just plain truth. That hits different. Nate let out a short laugh. "Man, you're cold." "Not really," I said quietly, looking at the whole setup, the fence perimeter, the stacked materials, the sign standing right in the middle like a flag planted after a quiet little war. Just done being polite. We did one final walk around, checking the lines, making sure everything held, that there was no easy way in or out without going through what we'd built. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to make a point. By the time the first light broke over the horizon, we were already packing up. Nate loaded the forklift back onto the trailer, Luis fired up the truck, and the 3 of us stood there for a second, looking out over what we'd made. In the daylight, it didn't look like a construction site anymore. It looked like a junkyard, contained, controlled, deliberate. "Think they'll get the message?" Luis asked. I watched the sun hit that red lettering, making it stand out even more against the rough wood. "Oh," I said, turning back toward the house, "they'll get it." And right on cue, we heard the first truck coming down the road. You can always tell when something goes wrong on a job site. There's a rhythm to those mornings. Trucks roll in, engines idle, guys hop out half awake, coffee in hand, everything moving on muscle memory. But that morning, the second that first truck rounded the bend and slowed down near my property line, that rhythm broke hard. The horn came first, one sharp blast, then another, longer this time, like the driver thought maybe the problem would move if he just made enough noise. It didn't. Then the engine cut, the door slammed, and a voice carried across the field, confused at first, then rising, pulling others into it. By the time the second and third trucks pulled up, there were 5, maybe 6 guys standing at the edge of my land, all of them staring out toward that fenced-off rectangle like it had no business being there, which, in a way, it didn't, just not for the reasons they thought. I was already on the porch by then, leaning against the railing with a fresh cup of coffee, the steam curling up slow in the morning air, just watching. I didn't rush out, didn't wave, didn't announce myself. I wanted them to sit in that moment for a second, to really look at what they were dealing with. One of them, hard hat, clipboard, the kind of guy who walks like he's used to being listened to, started pacing along the property line, pointing, talking fast into his phone. I didn't need to hear him to know who he was calling. A minute later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I let it ring. It buzzed again and again. Luis, who'd stuck around longer than Nate that morning, leaned against one of the porch posts, arms folded, watching the scene unfold like it was a live show. "You gonna get that?" he asked, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I took a slow sip of coffee, eyes still on the field. Not yet. Out there, the pacing guy, same voice from the day before, I'd bet money on it, was getting louder now, frustration bleeding through every movement. One of the workers tried stepping closer, maybe thinking they could just grab what they needed and go. But the second he reached the fence line and saw the barbed wire, the tires, the way everything was boxed in, he stopped. Because now it wasn't just materials sitting in an open field. Now it was a boundary. And crossing it, well, that meant something. I set my coffee down and finally walked out, slow, unhurried, boots pressing into the grass like I had all the time in the world, because I did. By the time I reached the edge of the property line, they'd all turned toward me. "You gotta be kidding me," the clipboard guy said, throwing his hands out. "What is this?" I tilted my head slightly, like I was taking a fresh look at it. "Storage," I said. "Figured I'd help you organize." A couple of the workers let out short, nervous laughs, the kind you can't quite hold back when something's both ridiculous and completely serious at the same time. The manager didn't laugh. "This is our material," he snapped. "You can't just—" "Actually," I cut in calm, not raising my voice. "It's your material on my land." He stepped closer to the line, stopping just short of where the grass shifted into my property. "We had an understanding." "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "You had an assumption." That landed. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way he glanced back at his crew like he needed to reassert control of something that had already slipped. "Look," he said, trying a different angle now, softer, more measured. "We've got a project running. Delays cost money. Just let us get in there, grab what we need, and we'll clear it out by the end of the week." I let that sit for a second, like I was considering it, even though I already knew the answer. "You remember what you told me yesterday?" I asked. He frowned slightly. "What?" I gave a small shrug. "Relax, it's not hurting anything." A couple of the guys behind him shifted, exchanging looks. The words sounded different now, hanging in the air where everyone could hear them. "That's not the same thing," he said quickly. "No." I agreed, nodding once. "It's not." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the county survey map. I'd walked the boundary lines enough times to know them by heart, but sometimes it helps to show people something official, something they can't just talk over. I unfolded it slow, holding it out just enough for him to see. "Every inch from that fence line," I said, gesturing toward the enclosure. "Back to those trees, that's mine." He didn't take the paper. Didn't need to. He knew. Behind me, from the porch, Luis cleared his throat just loud enough to draw attention, and when the manager glanced past me, he saw what I'd already known was there. Sheriff Daniel's cruiser, parked quiet along the side of the road, engine off, window down. The man himself sitting inside with one arm resting on the frame. Watching like this was just another slow morning in town. Now, I hadn't called the sheriff to make a scene. I called him because I wanted everything above board, clean, no room for anyone to twist what happened next. Daniels had known my grandfather, knew that land, and when I told him what was going on, he just said, "I'll come take a look." The manager's tone shifted again, sharper this time, but there was something underneath it now, uncertainty. "You really gonna do this?" he asked. I glanced past him at the enclosure, at that sign standing right in the middle, bright red letters catching the full morning light now. "Already did," I said. There was a long moment where nobody moved, where the weight of the situation finally settled in. They couldn't just walk in, not without making it clear they were trespassing again. They couldn't move the fence without damaging something, and that opened up a whole different set of problems. And every minute they stood there, their schedule slipped a little more. He pulled his phone out again, stepping off to the side, voice low but tense as he started making calls. I didn't listen. Didn't need to. The outcome was already unfolding. By the time I walked back up to the porch, Louise let out a low whistle. Man, you just cost them a lot of money. I picked up my coffee again, now just the right temperature, and took a slow sip. They did that themselves. The calls kept coming in over the next couple of days, different numbers, different voices, all trying some version of the same thing. Offers, explanations, even a half-hearted apology at one point. Like that might smooth things over enough to undo what had already been set in motion. I didn't take any of them. Because here's the truth, it was never about the materials. It wasn't even about the inconvenience. It was about the assumption that they could step onto something that wasn't theirs, use it, reshape it, and then walk away like it didn't matter. A couple weeks later, word started drifting back through town, the way it always does, bits and pieces at first, then the full picture. The Green Hollow Clubhouse project delayed. Not just a few days, months. Turns out replacing that much material on short notice isn't cheap, and schedules don't bend just because you want them to. Some folks said I went too far. Others said I didn't go far enough. That's the thing about situations like this. Everyone's got an opinion when they're not the one standing in your boots. As for the land, well, most of it went back to the way it was. Grass grew over the tire marks. The quiet came back. Mornings felt like mornings again. But that corner, the one where we built that enclosure, I left it. The wire's still there, a little more rusted now. The tires settled deeper into the ground. The sign faded, but still readable if you know where to look. I don't keep it because I need a junkyard. I keep it because sometimes people need a reminder. Every now and then, I'll see cars from that neighborhood slow down as they pass, heads turning just slightly, like they're not sure if they should be looking at it or not. And I just sit there on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the same land my grandfather once walked, thinking about what he said. Land remembers who respects it. So I'll ask you this honestly. If you walked out one morning and found someone treating your property like it didn't belong to you, would you have left their stuff alone? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Let me know, because I've heard both sides, and I've got a feeling this one's not as simple as people like to think.